This is Demon's Choice by Jasmine Wallace, and I'll be reading from chapter 3. Lena practically skipped across the square after the cafe closed. She had a few hours before her date with Ambrose, and whilst she planned on using most of that time to get ready, she thought she would walk around the town first to try and burn off some of her excitement. Pulling her coat close to her body, she made her way down a side alley to the town's edge. It was only a few minutes' walk from the square, but shortly she came to the gate built into the western wall. She walked through before turning to the right and heading towards the river that ran along the wall. She liked it here. It was quiet, and few people walked through here at this time of day. The path that ran between the river and wall was more suited for morning walks for people with dogs, if at all, as halfway along it rose steeply up the hillside. Small bridges were dotted along the river, despite the fact that it was narrow enough for most people to be able to simply jump across it. Lena noted that the movement of the river had stopped the snow from sticking along its edge, keeping the river stones exposed to the cold winter air. Behind the river was an evergreen forest that expanded up the hill ranges. Its trees stood tall and proud against the evening mist that was starting to descend. She liked to walk along the forest edge, but rarely ventured within it, especially not when the mist made it impossible to see more than 2 meters of ground in front of you. Jumping over the river, she smiled at the crunch of the stones beneath her boots. Regardless of the cold in her apartment getting the best of her most days, she loved the winter. The smell of moisture on the air, the cold biting at her cheeks, giving her more color in them than she had naturally, and the soft quiet afforded by the layers of snow. She had never seen snow until she moved to the town, but she had instantly fallen for its magical qualities. Taking in the stillness of the forest, Lena walked up the hill towards a small lookout she had found 2 years ago. From there, she could look over the town all the way down to the train station at the bottom of the valley. Panting against the cold air, she welcomed the burning of her lungs. The exertion warmed her body, although she made sure to keep her coat on as she reached her destination. There was a metal bench at the lookout, and she gratefully sat upon it, after brushing off the snow, letting her legs rest. From here, she could see the roofline of Ambrose's manor. Even though her heart was racing from the climb, she was elated. She knew the smile that had been on her face since Ambrose asked her out had not left her face for the remainder of the afternoon. Since moving to the town, she had not formed any relationships with anyone that could have developed into anything romantic. Sarah had set her up with Michael a few months after she started at the cafe, but they mutually agreed that there was no compatibility there. She had started to think she would spend the rest of her life single, and she had been fine with that. She liked her solitude, and the ability to do what she wanted when she wanted, without having to worry about someone else. That all changed when she met Ambrose. The rumors that surrounded him had been intriguing, but she had mostly ignored them. She had wanted to be ignored when she moved to the town, so she felt inclined to provide him with the same courtesy. The first time he came into the cafe, she almost dropped the tray she had been holding. He was gorgeous, and he'd been staring right at her. Her breath had caught in her throat as she felt a magnetic pull towards him. Her mind had instantly thought of what it would be like to feel his arms around her, his lips on hers. She knew who she was, and she couldn't fathom why he would be looking at her so intently. But it made her stomach flip with excitement. At the time, she had practically run into the kitchen, trying to hide her embarrassment at her reaction to him. Michael had looked at her confused as she hid in the staff closet briefly. After gathering herself, she had made her way back into the cafe and was disappointed to note that he had left. It was a few days after that he had returned and took up residence at his favorite table. At first, they had exchanged small talk here and there, but nothing much beyond that. Lena thought there was an attraction between them, but she always put it down to simple flirtations to entice good service, not something that would or could develop further. Then he started coming more frequently, and the flirtations increased. His visits to the cafe had become a highlight of her day, to the point she often found herself wandering by his manor on days he didn't visit, wondering if he was okay. She was also certain that on days she wasn't working, she had spied him following her, watching her as she walked through town. With her breathing returning to normal, she stood up and bounced on the spot for a moment, giggling to herself in excitement. She turned to make her way back down the hill, but paused briefly, looking into the woods. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she had the sudden feeling that she was being watched. She shook her head, murmuring to herself that she was being ridiculous, and stepped onto the path. She still had a couple of hours before the date, so she wanted to head back to her apartment to start getting ready. Having barely taken a few steps down the path, her stomach dropped as she heard footsteps behind her. She turned her head slightly, but before she could see who it was, a hand with a rag or napkin in it covered her mouth and nose. Crying out, she tried to push the hand away, but within moments her world went dark. There's a little break. She was late. Ambrose looked at his watch again as he sat at the restaurant. Well, not late. Not yet. It was still a few minutes to 8. To his surprise, he arrived almost 20 minutes early, eager to see Lena again. He had already ordered a bottle of wine for them and sipped slowly on his own glass as he waited for her. Any time the bell over the door rang, he raised his head in expectation, and, to his chagrin, had been disappointed every time. He sighed heavily as he looked out the window at the street. It had been decades since he last went on a date with a human, and back then they met at dances, or he would collect them from their home, so only his punctuality had ever mattered. But then, he never remembered being as excited to see someone as he was Lena. He would happily give her the grace of waiting another 15 minutes, considering a fresh layer of snow was, yet again, starting to fall outside. "Can I get you anything else while she waits, sir?" He looked up dubiously at the waiter who now stood next to the table. Ambrose knew what he wanted, but he doubted the waiter could make her walk through the door. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, turning back to the window. The waiter walked off quietly, leaving him once again to his thoughts. He didn't think there would be any reason Lena would not come. He was sure she liked him, and when he asked, her face had lit up with the most adorable smile. He rolled his eyes at himself. "You're a demon, Ambrose," he reminded himself. But there was no denying it. He had been enchanted by her since he first saw her. The pull he had felt towards her that day had only intensified as time went on. He wanted to get to know her, more than just the side she showed within the cafe. He knew there was more to her than a simple waitress. There was a deep intelligence in her eyes that was beyond intriguing, suggesting a breadth of life experience more suited to someone twice her age. Her beauty was simple yet elegant and always unassuming. Unlike most women her age, now she didn't try to overstate her features with too much makeup. Having lived through many a fashionable era, from the French Revolution to Victorian delicacy to 50s glamour, regardless of the progressions in feminine identity those eras were responsible for, he found natural beauty more enticing than anything. He looked at his watch again, noting she was now indeed late. Suddenly he felt the familiar pull of a summoning. Sighing in annoyance, he realized dejectedly that he was going to miss dinner with Lena. Of course, she was already late, but only by a couple of minutes. He doubted she would wait the 2 hours it would take for him to revert to human form after this. Quickly, he got to his feet and threw some money down on the table. He walked out of the restaurant as quickly as he could, voicing his apologies to the host as he went, and making a quick dash into an empty alley. Accepting the inevitability of the summoning, Ambrose made a mental note to take flowers the next time he went to Café Marie. He could foresee lots of apologizing in his near future. Flames covered his body as he was forced to transform into his demonic self. Over the years he had become accustomed to the pain as his horns broke through his skin and his limbs stretched and lengthened. His nails extended into talons and his skin darkened as the flames licked over his body. His clothes burned away and were replaced with his usual chosen attire for such events. As the flames dissipated, he noted that he had been brought to an abandoned warehouse somewhere downtown in the city. He raised his brows, surveying his surroundings. The building was dark, except for some lamps that had been set up in the four corners, but to avoid detection, black paint had been splattered on the windows, stopping the light from reaching outside. Overall, the room wasn't very large, seemingly more suited for small-scale production, with the floor space being less than 10 meters wall to wall. Summoning runes had been painted on the floor with the sacrifice's blood. White ash, cat bones, and offcuts of the flower immortelle had been placed in a circle around the makeshift pyre, made from pallets and black fabric. 3 men stood in awestruck shock near the pyre. Ambrose froze as he took in the view of the pyre. Ice washed through his limbs, and his breath caught in his throat as he looked over the woman atop it. Her wrists had been slit, fastened to the pyre by strips of fabric, and positioned above 2 bowls that now held her lifeblood. His body shuddered as he recognized her face, her dove-gray eyes staring at him blankly, dulled by death. "Lena,"